All right, good morning or good afternoon to some of you. Today we're going to cover Chapter 8 in our book. It mainly deals with population ecology, biodiversity, and species interactions. All right, the last big idea we had was from the last chapter. This big idea number 2 is that populations cannot grow indefinitely because resources are limited and there is competition for those resources. So there's no way for populations to continue to grow. This is a good thing when it comes to sustainability. We want populations to be limited so we maintain biodiversity. All right, the main component to this chapter is population dynamics. And population dynamics are the study of how and why populations change in their distribution, their numbers, the age structure, and the density. And that all has to do with the response to changes in environmental conditions within their habitat. Okay, looking at some habitats, we're going to see that some species count more than others, and we've talked about this a little bit, but the changes in the growth rate of, say, invasive species, keystone species, and ecosystem engineers here, or frontier species, have a greater impact on the biodiversity of an area than other species. And so those populations will control other populations in their interactions. Distribution, let's look at the distribution of populations. All right, so when scientists study population dynamics, they look at a lot of different factors, and we talked about some of the main factors like distribution, numbers, age structure, and density. But when they look at those things, they look at the study of how different things affect those main components. So, for example, how disease might affect a population density or population distribution, or how the introduction of a non-native species affects a population, or how the presence of a chemical like pesticides affect populations. And one example of this in the Northwest is how DDT affected the numbers of bald eagles, because DDT accumulated in salmon and was then eaten and accumulated in eagles, and it caused their shells to be softer and not support their young. So studying these things can help us identify keystone species and also how to maintain those species. All right, so the first main piece of population dynamics is population distribution. And that's looking at how animals or plants are spread throughout their ecosystem. And there are three basic patterns that we've noticed in nature. The first is uniform or nearly uniform. The second is randomly dispersed. And finally, clumped. And you can see here the white dots represent species in an ecosystem. And here they're clumped, random, and relatively uniform. All right, so as the book mentions, when looking at populations, clumped patterns of distribution are by far the most common in both plants and animals. So clumped schools of fish here, they're all together, or sea otters living in a community all together there. We oftentimes see this with birds flying in flocks, and here cottonwood trees growing along a watershed, anything like that where the species are living together in a clump is really common. Why is clumped distribution the most common? It's because clusters often occur where there are resources available. Of course, if there's water and food in an area, animals are going to flock to that together. Also, they're more likely to find the resources if they work together to find them. The third reason is protection from predators. So in a herd like deer, for example, they're more to look out for each other and also to protect each other. Four is teamwork to catch prey. So predators actually, like if you think about wolves hunting in packs, it helps them to catch their prey. And finally, five, mating groups or helping to raise their young. And whales do this for sure, where they get together in a clump or a cluster like the humpback whales in Hawaii to mate and also to help rear their young. And we know the common example here of the emperor penguins that clump together to rear their young and stay warm. The second type of distribution is uniform distribution, and this especially occurs with plants where they have, like here, the second growth forest, where they're all planted at the same time, and they can only grow a certain distance from each other in order to get the resources they need, like light, water, nutrients from the soil. Some plants, in fact, secrete chemicals that prevent others from growing nearby, and this increases the chances of them all to get the water and soil nutrients that they need. The third type of distribution is random distribution, and this is pretty rare. You can see here the dandelions in this field. There's no real reason for this type of distribution. It just happens to be where their seeds fall, and it's really pretty random, hence it's called random distribution. You don't see any pattern of clumping or uniformness. Folks who study population dynamics are trying to figure out why exactly different populations have random, uniform, or clump distribution, and we learn from different factors why, say, these sea stars here, the ochre sea stars, are clumped together, and it's likely for feeding reasons, and distribution can give us clues into what's happening within a population. The next thing we're going to look at with population dynamics is population size. All right, so when looking at population size, we're looking at four main variables. First is the birth rate, so those are added into the population. That's called natality. Then there's the death rate, mortality, so people dying off. Then there's, or animals. And then there's the immigration rate, so those who immigrate in from somewhere else into the community. The next is emigration, in which people are leaving, or animals are leaving a community and going somewhere else. So when trying to figure out exactly the number or population size, say of polar bears in a particular area of Alaska, we would take the birth rate and add it to the immigration rate, those polar bears that are migrating in from somewhere else, and we'd subtract those polar bears that have died with those polar bears that have left to go somewhere else. And that would give us our total population of polar bears in that particular community. Okay, here I bring up my favorite guy here, E.O. Wilson, who studied those ants when we talk about biotic potential. And biotic potential is one of those vocabulary terms you just kind of need to memorize. The biotic potential is a population's capacity for growth under ideal conditions. So, for instance, these blue whales, if they have all the food, water, shelter, and space they need, how big would their population get? And by big, I mean how many numbers of blue whales would there be? Now, blue whales eat really tiny food, little krill and shrimp, and basically they're grazers in the water. But let's say they had all the food, the krill that they could eat. What numbers of blue whales would there be out there without any limiting factors? And as a general rule of thumb, folks who study populations across the globe have found that big things tend to have low biotic potential, so they have not a huge growth rate of populations, whereas little things like ants have a high biotic potential, and that their population numbers can increase quickly. It takes much longer for blue whales' population numbers to increase than it does, say, these ants, and we'll look at why here. Your quick think number one, I want you to give me an example of an organism with a low biotic potential and an organism with a high biotic potential. So remember, biotic potential is their growth rate under ideal conditions. So you're looking for those that have kind of a slow growth rate versus those that have a fast growth rate under ideal conditions. Okay, the next thing we're looking at is intrinsic rate of increase. R is our first letter of the alphabet here for our alphabet soup. And R stands for the intrinsic rate of increase, which is the rate at which a population would grow if it had unlimited resources. And that sounds very close to biotic potential. Species with a high R usually reproduce early in life, have short generations, can reproduce often, and have lots of offspring each time, such as these mice here, or these frogs here, where they have a ton of eggs or a ton of little mice. They reproduce often and have lots of offspring each time. So the question is, what's the difference between biotic potential and intrinsic rate of increase? This has to do with more the rate in which they grow with unlimited resource, so actually how they grow. And biotic potential is their capacity for growth. So a little bit different there, not too different. In fact, some papers or some research articles actually use these interchangeably. All right, and we talked about this earlier in the week when we talked about R-selected species versus K-selected species, two different reproductive strategies here. R-selected species, like this mouse here, have a high biotic potential, meaning that they have a really high growth rate in ideal conditions. They have lots of offspring, little or no parental care. They just kind of leave their offspring out to fend for themselves. And they usually tend to be opportunist species, so those like these dandelions or other weedy type species that are able to take over in areas that are more disturbed that other species could not live in. On the other extreme of reproductive strategies are those K-selected species. So those which have a low biotic potential or a low growth rate in ideal conditions. They have few offspring. They require lots of parental care, so they tend to be larger, like these elephants or apes, and they usually are very competitive species in that ideal environment. It just takes them longer to increase their numbers in their population. And as I mentioned in the lecture earlier this week, most species fall somewhere in the middle between the far left, which are the R-selected species, which have a really high intrinsic rate of increase or biotic potential, and the K-selected, which are really slow to increase their population sizes. So like these dogs here have characteristics of both the R-selected and the K-selected, in that they raise and nurture their young, and yet they tend to have quite a few pups at once. All right, now we need to relate this idea of population dynamics back to kind of our overarching theme for the course, which is sustainability. And if you look on page 24 of your textbook, you see that there are four main components to sustainability as far as our book is concerned. One is biodiversity, and we've talked about that. The other is population control, nutrient cycling, and reliance on solar energy. So this has to do with population control. And lucky for us, a species can't keep growing and growing. There are these things called limiting factors that prevent this. And that adds into sustainability, because if populations continue to grow and grow, there wouldn't be space for others, decreasing biodiversity and nutrient cycling, and the whole thing would crumble. So lucky for us, like I said, there are these limiting factors, and those include competition for resources, predators, disease, lack of resources, things like that. And now we're looking at population density. Population density is the number of individuals in a given volume. Here, very high population density. You can see lots of fish in a small area or small volume. So why does population density matter? Well, there are these controls or limits that some are density dependent. So depending on the number of species in a given area, they're potentially limited in their availability of resources. So the larger the number, or the more dense the population, the more competition you get for those resources. Also, the larger the number, or the more dense the population, the more chance for predation, right? Because it's easy to catch prey when there are a lot of them there. There's also a higher amount of parasitism. So parasites are easy to spread through a population, and disease is the same way. There are also clear examples of poisoning for those populations, because they may all be drinking the same water in the same area. And then finally, human harvesting can affect populations with higher densities than with lower densities. And some factors really aren't dependent on the density of a population. So regardless of how many of a particular plant or animal is there, doesn't matter what controls that population. So especially the abiotic factors like natural disasters or global warming or ozone depletion, it's going to wipe out a population, or it's going to alter a population regardless if there are lots of them or just a few of them. And so we say it's density independent. It's not dependent on the numbers there. Those factors will influence the population regardless. There are two main factors at play when you look at population density. The first one is what we call environmental resistance. So those are the things that are the limiting factors for the population, like lack of food or nutrients, lack of water, lack of suitable habitat, bad weather, predators. All these environmental resistance factors or limiting factors decrease a population, hence it moves it this way. And then there are the biotic potential of a population, the growth rate in ideal conditions, that move it this way. So in the middle here is kind of the balance between this environmental pushback, the resistance, and the number of individuals based on how fast they can grow in ideal conditions. Their reproductive rate, their ability to migrate or move to new places, to invade new habitats, like I just said, their ability to defend themselves from predators and to cope with bad conditions as well. So all of these components, weighing the biotic and the resistance here, determine how many of a population are there. Okay, so let's dive into exactly what is environmental resistance. It sounds like very defensive, but essentially environmental resistance is just a term we put on a combination of all the factors, the limiting factors, to the growth of a population. So obviously if it's an ideal conditions, a population would grow to its biotic potential. But unfortunately, there are things that limit these populations, or fortunately for us actually, so we have more biodiversity. But these factors determine essentially what the carrying capacity is for that particular population. So that is exactly the maximum number of species that can survive in a given area. So here in my fish tank, I've got 2 of these clownfish here. And their numbers, these clownfish would take up the whole tank, except for they're limited by the environmental resistance by the tank. And the limiting factors here in the tank are the space and the food that I feed them. I only feed enough to handle 2 of these little clownfish here. And the same is true of the coral. They're limited by a combination of food, water, shelter, and space. If there were predators in there to the coral, it would be limited by that or other factors as well. But the environmental resistance combine to determine what the carrying capacity is for a given population within an environment. So when we look at graphs of populations throughout the generations, there are different, we call them curves, or the way that it graphs out. So here we have our R-selected species, these mice, and you see they grow exponentially here in this swooping J curve, we call it. And their population explodes and they're way over their carrying capacity. And after overgrazing, they die off real fast because there's not enough food left for them. So this is kind of a typical J-shaped curve here. And when they die off, their numbers go below the carrying capacity, and they are predicted to then increase once their food source comes back. And then there's something known as an S-shaped curve, and if you turn this sideways here, you'll see that S. And essentially that's where the population's held in balance, where sometimes the S-shaped curve will even come up here above the carrying capacity. We saw this when we played the Oh Dear game or activity earlier, or last week, I suppose it was. Okay, so for your next quick think, we've heard a lot about different letters here symbolizing different things. So what are the letter symbols? You've heard J-shaped curve, S-shaped curve, K-selected, R-selected. So tell me what those letters are and what they stand for. Next thing, we're going to look at genetics and population dynamics, tying in sort of last unit's information into this unit's information. We know that genetic diversity is essentially the difference in genes or genetics among members of a population. So if the genetics of these snails here code for certain coloring of a shell, we can see that we have quite a bit of genetic diversity here. We've got dark shells and light shells and striped shells across the board. And this genetic diversity, especially when it comes to our immunity to different diseases and things like that, is a really important factor in the long-term health and survival of a population. For instance, without the dark shading here of these snails, maybe a predator wouldn't be able to see the dark ones, and so those dark ones would survive, and the snails would not go extinct because they have this genetic diversity, and the dark shading allows them to camouflage. So genetic diversity, as far as populations are concerned, is always a good thing. And when I say good, my objective is biodiversity. So when we say good, if my objective is to eat as many snails as possible, that's not a good thing. We don't want genetic diversity because we want all the ones we can see. But here my objective is from an ecological standpoint, and it's biodiversity. So the more different types or the more genetic diversity we have, the more chance of survival of this population, and the better. All right, so one thing we didn't talk about when we were talking about genetic diversity and speciation and all that jazz, we never really talked about what's called the founder effect. Oops. So the founder effect is essentially where a small group of individuals becomes separated from the larger population. And if you look over here, imagine if these blue circles here are a specific population. Maybe these are all whitish polar bears in the blue with the capital AAs, and this light blue one with the A and lowercase a is a lightish brown polar bear, or brown or whitish gray. Down here, this circle bit here from the initial population gets separated through a bottleneck. Maybe there was an earthquake and one of the glaciers moved away from another. And this is the new population where you have 3 here that are white and 1 that is light brown. Obviously a larger population that is this light brown color. And eventually over time, this population grows, and as you can see, we have far more of the light brown types. And over time, this new population has a much higher frequency of this light grayish brown colored polar bear. So essentially you get separated from the large group, you have a different kind of genetic makeup than the previous group, and then you end up with this population with far more occurrence of the previous with the gray instead of just like all white and just 1 gray. All right, so one thing we've touched on before that I wanted to get back to is this thing called the bottleneck effect. And it essentially is when only a small group survives a change in the environment. So a small group within an original population. So let's say here this bottle is full of, you can see, blue, white, and yellow members of this population. And then there's some type of bottleneck event. And in the end, the surviving population is only blue and white. You've lost the yellow type from this genetic diversity. An example of this, of the bottleneck effect, is imagine if one year there's a really big drought in a wetland. And in that particular wetland, there are green, yellow, and brown frogs, okay? And because there was a big drought, the surrounding habitat is brown. So only the brown frogs survive through that year. So there are no more green or yellow frogs. This is what's called a bottleneck effect, and as a result, you end up with a lack of variation and less adaptability. So you have less variation in that you no longer have green, yellow, and brown frogs. Now you just have brown frogs, and as a result, you have less adaptability. So if the next year is a really wet year and a green environment exists, those brown frogs are going to stand out. They're unable to camouflage to their environment. Sometimes humans actually create the bottleneck in other species because of our habitat fragmentation or other interactions with the environment. All right, so looking at genetic diversity, there's something known as genetic drift. And essentially that's when a population goes from looking one way to another, or from having genes one way to another. And it occurs more often in small populations. So obviously if there was a large number of frogs in the population, chances of losing all of the green and yellow frogs in one year is pretty slim. But in a small population of frogs, if you have green, yellow, and brown frogs, there's a much greater chance that you might lose all the greens and yellows, and then the population would drift to only including brown frogs in the years to come. So fluctuations in these gene frequencies, so coding for green or yellow, in a small population from one generation to the next is much more common than in a larger population. So the smaller the size of the population, the more likely there is to be a major shift in what's called allele frequency. Think of alleles as genetics. So here we have brown and green insects here. The green ones tend to be closer to the top of the organic layer where it's more green. Human feet smash these green insects, and over time we have this genetic drift toward more brown insects. It's not always a case with color. It can be something as small as changes in shape of hands or feet or size of people, things like that. You have likely heard of the term inbreeding, and this affects populations greatly. So when population sizes get really small, individuals in a small population mate with each other, and oftentimes they're related, which is a bummer for them because this increases the frequency of defective genes, where you get animals. We like to call them funny-looking animals here, where they have defective abnormalities. And oftentimes these don't lead to greater survival. In fact, they lead to less survival. Another vocabulary term here, minimum viable population. So viable means sustainable, or where they're able to survive, and minimum, the lowest amount of survivable population. So the minimum number of individuals needed to maintain a species for the long term. And this does not include inbreeding because that's not sustainable for a population. And the next thing we're talking about is population growth patterns. And you have all studied this, I believe, in human geography, but we're looking at animal and plant species for population growth patterns now. One population growth pattern is a stable one in which it fluctuates a little bit above and a little below the carrying capacity here. It's found in stable ecosystems like rainforests or old growth forests, and we saw this with our deer population before we introduced a predator in O deer. All right, the next type of population growth pattern is called eruptive, in which a population explodes, boom, and then stabilized at a lower level, boom. And it's often tied to the seasons, so this happens especially like with things like mosquitoes and other short-lived things. Algae, for example, when you have a big algal bloom here, it explodes and then it levels off. Another type of population growth pattern is cyclic, in which there's a boom and bust, sort of like the links in the hair, where every few years or generations it booms and then busts, booms and then busts. And notice here, the lynx is following the boom and bust of the hare population. The final population growth pattern that we're looking at is called irregular growth pattern, and it's irregular, you see, because there's really no cyclical boom, bust, anything like that. It's kind of irregular. It doesn't really have a rhyme or reason for it, although if you look back at specific factors, you can see that with this moose population here, there was a dramatic collapse here, and it turns out it was caused by severe winter weather, leading to a food shortage, and then also likely a result of predation. So you can look back at population patterns and determine what the growth pattern is. In this case, it's irregular because there's not cyclical or anything like that. Finally, looking at age structure of populations, and again, you did this in human geography, shouldn't be too new. Okay, so we're looking at age structure at 3 different populations here with both males and females in these particular populations. And you can see we have one here where we have a lot of young individuals here. That would be a rapidly increasing population, as I'm sure you've heard about. This middle one here, you see a few here. It's much less wide here at the base, meaning we have slow increase in population as we go up in age or through the years. And then here, this is pretty stable population. Notice the number of population is pretty much the same as you go up. Okay, for your third quick think, I want you to reflect on these population growth patterns and think about a population of deer for this particular quick think. And imagine the deer were growing at a rapid rate here, or no growth rate, or maybe they were decreasing. And what are the impacts economically of those growth patterns, socially and environmentally? What does it do for the area? So think about, you're going to end up with 9 actually answers for this particular quick think. So do your best economics, socially, and environmentally. All right, we're just about done with today's lecture, but you have to choose one. This is kind of a funny little add-in here. Would you rather sleep in a bed of rats, catch a porcupine thrown from a second-story window, ouch, be sprayed by a skunk, let a rattlesnake slither across your body, let bumblebees cover you from head to feet, again, ouch, let a tarantula walk across your face, give a speech to the student body with only your underwear on, or shave off your head, hair, and your eyebrows for the rest of the year? You decide. Write it on your quick think page. I'm curious. All right, since we're done with our lecture, we're going to do a little stump the class. For the rest of today, I want you to work in teams of 2 to 3. And of course, if you haven't gone to print out your environmental legislation project, let's get that done. Remember, you're not printing one out for the entire class now. I kind of want to reduce that, so you need to share it with me on Google Drive or send me a copy of it, and that way I can post it onto the Dome Troll site. But let's only make 15 copies of that legislation project. But back to Stump the Class. What I want you to do is work in teams of 2 or 3. Each person needs to write one multiple choice or short answer question on your index card from Chapter 8. The questions on one side, the answers on the other. Make them good. And you're going to share your questions with your team and revise them if necessary. So everybody's doing this. And then you're going to give your cards to Mr. Pace as your exit ticket for today. And you will see how we use these cards. So work at making them challenging. All right, have a good day.